Donald Trump has recently begun his second term, and his policies are already causing significant global shifts. In Europe, for instance, Trump is considering reducing the American military presence and decreasing US financial contributions to NATO, which puts Europe in a very vulnerable position. After all, since the end of the Second World War, European countries have relied heavily on US protection. The problem is that, as Russia's invasion of Ukraine has shown, Putin is playing for real, and many fear Europe could be next. The question is, can Europe really afford a war on its own? That's what we'll discuss today. First, we'll talk about the American support to the European Union, and then we'll take a look at Europe's financial state. And as a bonus, I will also tell you how I'm making money with the scenario I'm about to show you. So first, what's Trump's position in relation to Europe? In short, Donald Trump wants to reduce the burden the US carries in defending the continent. For him, US military spending in Europe is an unfair burden on American taxpayers. And since his campaign, Trump has criticized European countries, arguing that they rely too heavily on American protection without contributing enough to NATO. In his view, Europe needs to stand on its own and increase its own defense investments, something he has reinforced by threatening to cut the US military presence in Europe and pressuring NATO allies to meet or even exceed the target of 2% of GDP in military spending. And honestly, Trump isn't wrong. As we see here, the US is by far the largest financial contributor to NATO, accounting for well over 50% of the military alliance budget. Even in terms of GDP percentage, the United States is only outpaced by Poland. As we see here, while Poland spends nearly 4% of its GDP on NATO defense, the US spends 3.5%. The difference is that, while Poland has Russia as a neighbor, being very close to the war, the US has a vast ocean separating it from any conflict in Europe. Now, what about Germany or France, the biggest economies in the Eurozone and very close to Russia too? How much do they spend on NATO defense? Less than 2% of their GDP, as we see here. On the other hand, European spending on social protection is sky high, with the EU allocating more than 25% of its GDP to this area. And these figures come from the European Commission, okay? And that's quite ironic, you know, spending so much on social protection and so little on the military. But you see, Trump's complaint is fair. If European countries are more concerned with spending on their citizens through the welfare state instead of investing in the military field, why shouldn't the US do the same and prioritize its own people? So yes, I think it would be fair for Americans to withdraw at least part of their financial contribution, right? Now, if the US withdrew its support, Europe would be left highly exposed and would need to scramble to catch up, investing heavily in defense. The problem is that, as we'll see now, Europe simply doesn't have the capacity to fund its rearmament. In fact, the European Union is so financially weak that if it starts seriously rearming, if it really begins preparing for war, it could collapse or trigger massive inflation. Now, while I get ready to do my part and walk you through how this could all unfold step by step, you on the other side of the screen can do your part too by liking this video and subscribing to this channel. Thanks! But why do I say Europe is in poor financial shape? Because you see, over the past 2 decades, the European Union has focused its efforts primarily on maintaining the welfare state, which is pretty expensive, by the way. And how did European countries manage this financially? Well, by spending heavily, spending far more than what they collected, and by taking on debt. Take a look at Italy, for instance, the third biggest economy of the Eurozone. Currently, Italy's debt-to-GDP ratio stands at 137%. But the situation gets even worse because, in addition to being heavily indebted, Italy hasn't recorded a single year of surplus over the past decade, as we see here. In other words, the Italian government spends far more than it collects. But you know, Italy doesn't represent all of Europe, right? What about France, the second largest economy in the Eurozone? Well, France is also deeply indebted, with a debt-to-GDP ratio at 110%. And like Italy, France has also been recording deficit after deficit over the past decade. Same thing when we look at Spain, the fourth largest economy in the European Union, with its debt to GDP at 105%. And again, Spain has also been running deficits year after year, as we see. The question is, how can countries in this financial state afford a war? If you are already deeply in debt and haven't managed to balance your books in any year, how can you keep spending so much? Well, a way to do that would be to raise taxes. But you see, taxes in Europe are already extremely high. Another way to keep spending heavily and fund a war would be by taking on debt, right? European countries could borrow more. But how can you take on more debt when you are already heavily indebted? Well, you can only do that if interest rates stay very low. The problem is that this comes with a cost, as we'll soon discuss. But the only countries doing decently are the ones up north, like Germany, the biggest economy in the Eurozone. Germany, for instance, has its debt much more under control, sitting at about 60% of GDP. It also has a way better financial track record than the other countries, being able to deliver surpluses for a good chunk of the last decade. Though lately it's been racking up some pretty hefty deficits, just like the rest of the EU. The point is, while Germany and a few other countries such as Sweden are not in a bad shape, the majority of EU nations are in absolutely rotten economic conditions. Under these circumstances, beginning to rearm will certainly be challenging, particularly given the high cost of military investments. I mean, where is the funding coming from? In my view, it can only come from debt. And now it's time for us to talk about how Europe rearming itself could break the Eurozone or cause massive inflation. You see, as I've explained in my last video, these countries like Italy, Spain, and France were only able to rack up this massive debt because of the low interest rates in the Eurozone. Now, why are interest rates so low there? Because you see, the Eurozone has some of the biggest economies in the world. You have France, which is the 7th largest economy globally, and Italy sitting at 8th. However, the real backbone of the Eurozone has always been the German economy. Now, the reason why the Eurozone gives access to cheap credit is because people believe that, for instance, if Portugal runs into trouble, the other big players will step in to help, like what happened with Greece. So if anything happens, these economic giants can save the party, right? So that's why lending to the Eurozone, at least so far, is seen as less risky. And the lower the risk, the lower the return rate. So that's how countries in this bloc manage to get loans at much lower rates than they would get if they were on their own. The problem is that, as we've seen, the truth is that nobody's in any shape to help anyone if things go south, because almost every EU nation is operating deeply in the red, delivering consecutive deficits while already heavily indebted. So in terms of genuine backing, Germany is the only one left. But even though Germany is doing better than the other countries, the truth is that Germany has its own problems too. For example, the energy source it was relying on, that is Russia, has dried up. On top of that, the Germans are facing tougher competition from China in the automotive sector. And finally, the German economy has also slowed down thanks to high taxes and bureaucracy. That's why the Germans are discussing easing off the debt brake, so they can stimulate the economy through more public spending, which means bigger deficits and more debt. And sure, that might work in the short term, but not in the long term. So, in part, Germany is also going downhill. The point I'm trying to make is this. Those ultra-low interest rates we saw at 0% in 2016, 2017, for example, and that allowed Europe to take on tons of debt, are most likely a thing of the past. Now we'll likely see structurally higher interest rates in the European Union, because borrowing for this bloc is simply getting riskier with each passing day. And if Europe's already in this financial mess without the burden of military spending, just imagine what it would be like with military expenses. I mean, the deficits would be way bigger and the debt would pile up even faster. In other words, the Eurozone would end up economically much weaker and therefore riskier, leading to much higher interest rates, which would in turn make military spending even more challenging. And as a lot of these countries are extremely leveraged, some of them might not handle these higher interest rates for too long. Yes, it's true that the European Central Bank has been cutting rates and that inflation is still under control, but my guess is that soon enough we'll see inflation picking up again, which will force the ECB to raise rates again. And why do I think inflation will rise in Europe? Well, basically because inflation is a symptom of government deficit. So if European governments keep ramping up spending, inflation's bound to show up eventually, one way or another. It's almost like a natural law. And as I've said, military expenses would make these deficits a lot bigger. But you see, when inflation finally hits, the ECB will have basically two options. Now, pay attention to this. First, the European Central Bank could raise interest rates to control inflation, right? But at the risk of breaking everyone. After all, as we've seen, the Eurozone is extremely leveraged. Or the European Central Bank could keep rates low anyway, tolerating higher inflation to allow for fiscal expansion in Eurozone countries. That way, it would indeed be possible to finance Europe's rearmament by taking on debt at artificially low rates. The problem is that that would tank the euro because it will lead to its devaluation. So the consequence would come in the form of inflation. And that's why, as I mentioned earlier, it's going to be very difficult for Europe to start rearming itself again, because the spending needed for that rearmament could either cause the EU to collapse, to break apart, because of higher interest rates, or trigger massive inflation in case the ECB tried to hold rates down artificially. So really tough situation Europe finds itself in. But okay, to close this video, now it's time for me to tell you guys how I'm making money with this whole deglobalization and monetary expansion trend we are seeing worldwide. Because what we've just seen is not happening only in Europe. Governments all around the world are heavily indebted and spending like crazy. And we are seeing geopolitical instability everywhere, in Asia, in the Middle East, even in South America, due to Venezuela's recent threats to invade Guyana. But anyway, I'm profiting from this macro scenario through my investments in gold and silver. And by the way, nothing in this video is investment advice, okay? Gold and silver have been go-to hedges against war and inflation for ages, and it's been a few years since I first started building my positions in these metals. But since I think these issues, such as inflation and deglobalization, are here to stay, I'm just gonna keep holding my positions while the prices of these metals continue to rise. Now, if you want to dive deeper into why I believe gold and silver will keep going up in value over the next years, just check out this video here. Okay? Well, that's it for today, and see you next time.